Hiteshew.
Well, thank you. That I don't know where Ben came up with all that. That sounded pretty good. And what he didn't tell me is that I was going to be the 501st speaker before all of you, and that's quite a lot of pressure. I hope there's a 502nd. So let me talk a bit about Puerto Rico. And when I was approached by Ben 6 months ago with the idea of doing this, of course, Hurricane Maria had not struck. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about what we were looking at Treasury, but I think it's very important that we address the post-hurricane situation as well. So let me just start with that I think we all know that on September 20th, Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico with a devastating Category 5 force. And it was actually the worst storm that has hit Puerto Rico in 90 years. And it wiped out much of its electric and telecommunications systems. It triggered flooding and mudslides, denuding the agriculture and beautiful forestry lands of Puerto Rico, and left many Puerto Ricans without access to reliable water supplies. Total damage estimates are still unknown, but they are running projected as high as $100 billion or even more. But Maria, as we're going to talk about today, was only the latest calamity to strike Puerto Rico. For more than a decade prior to the storm, Puerto Rico had been suffering from a severe economic and fiscal crisis unknown to most Americans. If there's a silver lining from Maria's destruction, it has finally brought to the attention of the rest of the United States that Puerto Rico's 3.4 million residents are in fact U.S. citizens, and that the combined impact of Maria and its pre-storm crisis require an urgent federal response. In fact, a recurring theme running through many of Puerto Rico's historical and current challenges is its unsettled political status. Many of you know it is neither a full-fledged state in the United States, nor is it an independent sovereign nation. So over the past nearly 4 years, 3.5 of the last 4 years, as Ben mentioned, I had a front row seat at the U.S. Treasury as the pre-storm crisis unfolded. And today, I want to share with you what we learned and how we attempted to respond. So let's get some basic facts about Puerto Rico on the table in terms of how we were looking at Puerto Rico, what we were confronting at the U.S. Treasury as I began to try to figure out what we were going to do with Puerto Rico. And this information that I'm giving you is the pre-storm condition of Puerto Rico. As I mentioned, 3.4 million U.S. citizens, but its population has declined by more than 10% over the past 12 years. And even before the storm, outmigration was accelerating. And it wasn't just the population was leaving, but what population was leaving. It wasn't all the wealthy. Everybody thinks there's a brain drain leaving Puerto Rico. In fact, it was the young people who are leaving, the people who are looking for a better future in the United States. And where are Puerto Ricans living in the United States? Again, the traditional thought is that New York City and the New York area has a significant population of Puerto Ricans, and that is true. But in fact, Florida now equals New York in the size of the Puerto Rican population. There are over 5 million in the U.S. Census who identify themselves as Puerto Rican, 1 million in New York and 1 million in Florida. Secondly, at the same time, Puerto Rico went into a significant economic recession prior to the Great Recession of the U.S. It started around 2006, and in total, the GNP of Puerto Rico has contracted 16% over that period since then. And there has not been 1 year. 1 year there was in 2010 with the stimulus, but other than that, every year has been negative growth. 12% unemployment rate, that would be much higher if there hadn't been the outmigration. Many of the people leaving were unemployed. So if that hadn't happened, the unemployment rate would be even higher. So it's almost 3 times what the rest of the U.S. is. And one of the very difficult issues is that the labor force participation rate, so you take the percentage of the population that's working. In the United States, it's about 2/3. In Puerto Rico, it's only 40%. Median incomes, $19,000 for all of Puerto Rico. That's about half of the U.S. and it's about, it's a third of the U.S. and it's about half of our lowest median income state, Mississippi. That's the population economic background. What's the fiscal situation? Based on audited financial statements, Puerto Rico's structural deficit has averaged $4 billion per year dating back for at least 6 years, which represents about 40% of its tax revenues. How is it financed? How has it been able to continue to finance itself when it's running a deficit that's 40% of its budget? It's done so by borrowing in the municipal bond market. It's done so by restructuring its debt and pushing out the problems to the future. It's used inter-fund loan transfers, and it's not made its required contributions to its pension fund, which is in and itself a form of borrowing. It has a very complex debt stock that it's run up that has many credits, as many as 15 different credits that compete for the same source of taxing authority or revenues that the Commonwealth can generate from its economy. And that is totaled over $50 billion, which again is about 1/3 of its budget. To give you an idea of how that compares, for example, to Florida, Ben's stewardship with the debt of the state of Florida is driven by a 6% policy, i.e. no more than 6% of Florida's state's revenues would be used to service its debt. Puerto Rico is over 5 times that number. Another form of debt, as I mentioned, are pension obligations. Future pension obligations due to Puerto Rico's public workforce totals $50 billion, and it is virtually unfunded. So in Florida, the pension system is about 90% funded. Again, to give you a contrast. And finally, really, one of the causes for many of these fiscal problems is that Puerto Rico has an unnecessarily complex governance structure and absence of adequate fiscal transparency, which has both contributed to the accumulated deficit and has made it difficult for stakeholders to really understand the nature and the magnitude of the crisis. In fact, at Treasury, that was one of our most difficult assignments, was just getting into the numbers and trying to make sense of it. Now, Puerto Rico, how did they get to this point? I think it's easy to say what is the current condition. But I found, anyway, as someone who really didn't know anything about Puerto Rico, I had never covered Puerto Rico as an investment banker, fortunately. But having the municipal lens to be able to try to understand Puerto Rico was incredibly helpful. One of the most interesting aspects of my service at Treasury was, as Ben said, I was one of the few people, if the only person, that knew anything about the muni market. But I had a whole bunch of sovereign debt experts who I learned an enormous amount from. They knew nothing about munis. And so they were asking me questions from a sovereign lens, and I was asking them questions from a muni lens. And it took a good couple months before we could even understand what the other person was saying. But it was incredibly valuable to have that dynamic at work. So let's just, again, go through a little bit of history here, because I think the historical context of how we got to where we are is critically important. I think we all know that in 1898, Teddy Roosevelt ran up the hill, and we won the Spanish-American War, and we got Puerto Rico from the Spanish. But what did that mean? We took on Puerto Rico as a territory, and those of you who know your Constitution may know that Article 4 of the Constitution says that unlike a state, that Congress is responsible for all rules and regulations as it relates to the territories. So for 120 years, Puerto Rico's had a status as a territory in which ultimately, and the Supreme Court has made many decisions on this in this regard, some as recently as a year and a half ago, that Puerto Rico is not a state and it is governed by Congress. In fact, from 1892 to 1952, Puerto Rico was governed by a territorial governor who was appointed by the President of the United States subject to U.S. Senate confirmation. In 1917, Congress enacted legislation granting U.S. citizenship to natural-born Puerto Ricans, but without statehood, they did not and do not today have the right to vote for President of the United States, nor to be represented in Congress. After World War II, the United States launched an economic policy for Puerto Rico called Operation Bootstrap, which was designed to raise incomes, to industrialize and modernize its economy away from an agrarian one up to that point. It was largely sugar and tobacco. And it included significant U.S. tax incentives, which today has resulted in Puerto Rico being by far the largest manufacturer of pharmaceuticals in the United States. So all the major pharmaceuticals generally use Puerto Rico as the source for their manufacturing of all the pharmaceuticals that are imported around the world and used here in the United States. In 1952, very important in Puerto Rico's history, the United States Congress, because it makes rules and regulations as it relates to the territory, drafted and adopted Puerto Rico's constitution. So can you imagine? Florida didn't wait for, or wasn't required to accept the constitution that it has today from Congress. As a state, as a co-sovereign with the United States, you wrote your own and approved your own constitution. It was approved by, at a vote, it was approved by the people of Puerto Rico, and it established them as a self-governed commonwealth with a elected governor, no longer appointed by the president, a bicameral legislature, and its own Supreme Court. The Puerto Rico Constitution requires a balanced budget. So that's a very interesting concept when you find where it is today. And in fact, they, up until recently, never ran out of money because of the ability, well, I think Ben can give us a tutorial on the difference between cash accounting and accrued accounting, and that doesn't quite fit into the Constitution. But nevertheless, it had the ability to borrow general obligation bonds, and it pledged to bondholders that it would give revenue priority to debt service ahead of essential services. That's an important concept that the municipal market relied upon in purchasing much of its debt. I think the question for the municipal market that we have never really confronted until recently is what happens when the political leaders of the local government, the state, the territory, have to choose between essential services and debt service. Puerto Rico, during this period, has largely been subject to the same U.S. laws and regulations as states, but as I'll point out, with some very important differences in programs and funding. But its residents do not owe or pay U.S. federal income taxes. It does, like most states, have its own income tax. But all workers in Puerto Rico do pay FICA, so their paycheck has payroll withholding, and they make contributions to Medicare and Social Security through FICA. Another important date, in 1965, our country enacted Medicaid, and every state in the country has a relationship between the federal government and operating Medicaid, and it's a reimbursement system. So it's based on actual costs, and there's a formula. I don't know what Florida's formula is, but I assume it's around 50%. I know the poorest state, it's based on population and poverty. I know the poorest state in the country gets a 73% reimbursement rate. That's Mississippi. The territories, including Puerto Rico, get a block grant, which is an interesting concept in the context of Obamacare and the ACA debate that we're having in Congress. Unfortunately, Puerto Rico's block grant is today about $400 million, and the cost of providing Medicaid services to their populations about 5 times that number. So effectively they get reformed, or Congress significantly reformed the bankruptcy laws in this country. Unbeknownst to anybody, we can't find any record why, Puerto Rico's municipalities were excluded from being eligible for bankruptcy protection under Chapter 9. All other states, municipalities have such, are eligible for such protection. Tying back the Medicaid issue, importantly, in 1994, the father of the current governor, his biggest achievement was to expand Medicaid coverage so that Puerto Ricans would be as eligible for Medicaid in Puerto Rico as they would be if they moved to a state in the mainland. That put Puerto Rico on a fiscal course that was perhaps almost inevitable to be where we are today, as they started funding that $2.4 billion today, with only $400 million of it coming from the federal government, so that their deficits started growing significantly as they expanded their health care coverage. Another important date, 1996, in a budget balancing piece of legislation during the Clinton administration, the up to then significant tax incentives that encouraged pharmaceuticals to manufacture in Puerto Rico and that contributed to the economic growth were, as a budget balancing tool, that was one of the elements, was to phase that out over 10 years. Not coincidentally, the onset of the recession in Puerto Rico began in 2006 as those tax incentives finally were wound down. In 2006, as the deficits began to develop, Puerto Rico enacted a sales tax for the first time and securitized that with the issuance of debt to the tune of, over the next 5 or 6 years, about $17 billion. Not a penny that went into productive capital investment, as when Ben sells bonds, what happens here in Florida and most places. But it went simply just to cover operating deficits. Finally, in 2013, Puerto Rico's bonds were downgraded to below investment grade. Florida is AAA or AA? AAA. Puerto Rico's a long way from being AAA today. Notwithstanding that downgrade and below investment grade, in an effort to retain sufficient liquidity, to have a runway, to try to right itself fiscally, and for the economy to recover, Puerto Rico borrowed $3.5 billion, largely from international sovereign investors and hedge funds, who saw Puerto Rico as a great opportunity for a very high interest rate. In fact, the interest rate was 8%, triple tax-free. That rate is between, what, 3.5 or so for Florida. Not surprisingly, that runway didn't last quite as long as Puerto Rico had hoped. And in June 2015, the governor declared that Puerto Rico's debt is unpayable, and that triggered a cascade of defaults over the next year that culminated in their GO bonds, their gold standard, defaulting in July of 2016. So in 2000, as the governor declares the debt unpayable, President Obama asked the US Treasury, what's our policy? What are we supposed to be doing now? Obviously, that conversation had been going on for 2 years prior to that, but that was where the urgency was. What shall the United States do? Let's go back to our Constitution again. Consistent with our federalist system, where states are co-sovereigns to the United States, and absent any systemic risks that a default in Puerto Rico would have on the larger capital markets, which we concluded it would not have any systemic effect, and in fact it has not. Ben continues to borrow at very attractive rates, notwithstanding Puerto Rico's massive default. Under our federalist system, because of this separation, and without systemic risks, there is no standby loan or loan guarantee authority to which the United States government can intervene in state and local government financial crises. That just doesn't exist. We had many law firms come in who were paid lots of money to tell us that we had such authorities, On behalf of Puerto Rico, we do not. Furthermore, even if we had such authority, it's not clear that a loan or a loan guarantee was the right response. And it would also be contrary to long-standing bipartisan, one of the few bipartisan policies, I would say, in Washington regarding moral hazard risk. So if we bail out Puerto Rico or we bail out Puerto Rico's investors, what does that mean for the next time? Similar kinds of issues that we all talked about in 2008 and 2009 in the financial crisis. Therefore, from the outset, our first answer to the president was what we're not going to do, not what we were going to do. And that was that Treasury made clear to everybody that there would not be a federal bailout for either Puerto Rico or its creditors. You may know that when Detroit went through its recent bankruptcy, there was no federal intervention because Detroit, under the Michigan Constitution, was a creature of the state of Michigan. The state of Michigan's legislature created Detroit, and it has responsibility under our constitutional relationship for Detroit. Detroit and Michigan, rather, used federal Chapter 9 bankruptcy laws to deal with Puerto Rico, Detroit, but Washington did not intervene. And I would contend that Puerto Rico is not a state, and the analogy is Puerto Rico is effectively Detroit, and Congress is Michigan. And so that was the framework under which we moved forward. With this background and the risk of Puerto Rico's broad default imminent, we developed a policy response. And the first was, given the absence of available federal tools, as I mentioned, there's nothing on the shelf, and that Puerto Rico is a territory governed under Article 4, that we decided we had to go to Congress, and that they were the ones with the power to address the crisis in any kind of comprehensive way. In the White House and at Treasury, they said they thought we had a 5% chance of getting anything done in Congress. They then told me afterwards they were trying to be nice in the meeting. It was really 0. So we launched an interagency process, and we came up with a legislative package that the administration would propose to Congress, which consisted of 4 prongs. One, it was very clear that Puerto Rico's existing fiscal institutions had failed, and their credibility urgently needed to be restored through the creation of a strong, independent, outside oversight board. This is a tried and true solution that has been used in the municipal market for decades. It includes New York City, it includes Washington, D.C., it includes Philadelphia, Cleveland, Detroit, have all used some form of intervention created by the state that gave supervision. I should say D.C. was created by Congress. That's the closest analogy to Puerto Rico. The second prong was that we had determined that Puerto Rico's debt was unsustainable, that in fact it was insolvent, and that it needed to be restructured before any long-term recovery could take root. And because Puerto Rico, as I said, was not eligible for bankruptcy protection, that our legislation would need to include some form of federal court-supervised debt restructuring tools that the oversight board could use to try to address the problem. Third, as I've talked about in terms of Medicaid here, we believe that that was a significant contributor to the fiscal imbalance, and that Congress needed to change the way Medicaid was funded in a way that made Puerto Rico closer to state-like funding. And fourth, we thought that the only way this was going to be solved is if Puerto Rico's economy could recover and begin growing. And that was the interest of both creditors and the citizens, residents of Puerto Rico and the United States. So we proposed a tax incentive called the Earned Income Tax Credit, rather, which is available everywhere to every place in the United States except for the territories because they don't pay federal income taxes. But there was a way that could be done, which would also, we think, not only stimulate economic growth on the island, but also try to address that low labor participation and pension cuts. So there's an enormous amount of uncertainty. There was enough before Maria, and now it's only worse. But I think it requires ultimately the attention, of all of us and the administration and Congress, if we're going to address the crisis of 3.4 million Americans that live in Puerto Rico. So.
Thank you. Thank you.